In the sweltering heat of Magnolia Grove Plantation, South Carolina, the summer of 1847 would forever be remembered as the season when God-fearing society witnessed something so shocking that 3 generations of families would carry the secret to their graves. What Martha Caldwell discovered in her husband's private chambers on that humid August morning would unleash a fury so devastating that when the dust settled, 4 men lay dead and an entire community had been forced to confront the darkest corners of human nature. Martha had been married to Jeremiah Caldwell for 12 years, watching him build Magnolia Grove into one of the most prosperous plantations in Beaufort County. She was the perfect planter's wife, elegant, refined, managing household affairs while maintaining the delicate balance of Southern femininity. But their marriage had grown cold, distant, and Martha had begun to notice things that made her stomach turn with suspicion. The way Jeremiah looked at certain slaves, the late-night meetings in the plantation office, the locked door to the east wing that was supposedly under renovation. Most disturbing of all were the 3 young men who seemed to have earned special privileges. Shazer, a house servant with striking features and intelligent eyes, Marcus, the stable master whose muscular frame caught every woman's attention, and Timothy, barely 19, who worked as Jeremiah's personal attendant. For months, Martha pushed away her growing suspicions. In 1847 South Carolina, such thoughts were unthinkable. Her husband was a church deacon, a respected member of the community, a man who quoted scripture at dinner and led family prayers every evening. But the signs were impossible to ignore. The way Caesar moved through the house with unusual confidence. How Marcus always seemed to be near the main house during evening hours. The expensive clothing Timothy wore, far better than any slave should possess. On the night of August 15th, Martha made a decision that would destroy everything. She had pretended to retire early, but instead waited in her darkened bedroom listening. Around midnight, she heard Jeremiah's footsteps in the hallway, followed by the soft closing of the east wing door. Her heart pounding, Martha wrapped herself in a dark shawl and followed. The humid night air was thick with the scent of jasmine and magnolia blossoms as Martha crept through the garden toward the east wing. A faint glow emanated from the windows, and as she drew closer, she could hear voices, low laughter, sounds that made her blood run cold. Pressing herself against the wall, Martha peered through a gap in the curtains. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her husband, completely unclothed, was engaged in intimate acts with all 3 men simultaneously. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment or a single transgression. The comfortable familiarity between them, the elaborate preparations of the room, the obvious routine of their interactions, all spoke of a relationship that had been ongoing for years. Martha stood frozen, watching the man she had shared a bed with, the father she had hoped would give her children, expressing more genuine passion and tenderness with these 3 enslaved men than he had ever shown her. The betrayal cut deeper than adultery, deeper than lies. This was a complete rejection of everything their marriage, their society, their very existence was supposed to represent. But Martha Caldwell was not a woman to be destroyed by betrayal. She was a woman who would use it as a weapon. The next morning, Martha sat at her writing desk with the calm precision of a general planning a military campaign. She penned 3 letters with deliberate care. The first went to Sheriff William Thornton, detailing exactly what she had witnessed, sparing no graphic detail that would ensure swift action. The second went to Reverend Samuel Morrison, the most influential preacher in the county, describing her husband's sins in language that would guarantee moral outrage. The third, and most devastating, went to the Charleston Mercury newspaper, ensuring that the scandal would spread far beyond Beaufort County. But Martha's true masterstroke was her 4th action. She walked directly to the slave quarters and gathered every enslaved person on the plantation. Standing before nearly 200 men, women, and children, Martha made an announcement that would seal her husband's fate. "Your master," she declared, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "has been living in sin with Caesar, Marcus, and Timothy. He has corrupted them and corrupted himself. The sheriff is coming. The whole county will know by sunset. I want every one of you to understand that this plantation is finished. But I also want you to know that I will not let innocent people suffer for one man's depravity." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some slaves wept, knowing that scandal meant separation from families as the plantation would surely be sold. Others looked at Caesar, Marcus, and Timothy with expressions ranging from petty to judgment. But what Martha had calculated correctly was that the news would spread like wildfire through the slave network, reaching every plantation in the county within hours. By noon, Sheriff Thornton arrived with 4 deputies. Martha met them at the front door, dressed in her finest black dress as if attending a funeral. She led them directly to the East Wing, where the evidence of her husband's activities was undeniable. The elaborate furnishings, the expensive linens, the personal items belonging to all 4 men painted a picture that required no explanation. Jeremiah was found in his study, already aware that his world was ending. He had heard the commotion, seen the sheriff's horses, understood that Martha had discovered his secret. When the deputies entered, he was sitting behind his mahogany desk, a loaded pistol in his hand. Staring at it as if contemplating his options, Jeremiah Caldwell, Sheriff Thornton announced, "You are under arrest for the crime of sodomy and corruption of slaves." But as the deputies moved to restrain him, something unexpected happened. Caesar burst into the room, having broken free from the slave patrol sent to arrest him. His eyes were wild with desperation, and in his hand was a kitchen knife he had seized during his escape. "Mr. Jeremiah didn't force us," Caesar shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "We chose this. We chose him. You cannot punish him for something we all wanted." The room erupted in chaos. Deputies drew their weapons, Jeremiah dropped his pistol in shock, and Martha stepped back against the wall, suddenly realizing that her carefully orchestrated revenge was spinning beyond her control. In that moment of confusion, Caesar made a decision that would define how this story ended. Instead of threatening the deputies or trying to escape, he turned the knife on himself, driving it deep into his chest before anyone could stop him. He collapsed to the floor, blood spreading across the Persian rug, his eyes fixed on Jeremiah's face. "I won't let them hang me like an animal," Caesar whispered with his final breath, "and I won't let them say you made me do this." The sheriff's men stood in stunned silence. None of them had expected this turn of events. In all the sodomy cases they had handled, they had never seen a slave take his own life to protect his master. But the tragedy was far from over. Word of Caesar's suicide had reached Marcus and Timothy before the slave patrol could capture them. Rather than face arrest, trial, and certain execution, both men had fled to the plantation's rice fields, where the irrigation channels created a maze of waterways perfect for hiding. Sheriff Thornton organized a manhunt immediately. Bloodhounds were brought in, every available man in the county was deputized, and a reward was posted for the capture of the 2 fugitives. But Marcus and Timothy knew every inch of Magnolia Grove's vast acreage. They had worked these fields for years, understood the rhythms of the tides, knew which paths stayed dry and which disappeared underwater. For 3 days they evaded capture, living on raw rice and marsh water, moving only at night, sleeping in hidden spots among the tall grass. But they were not trying to escape to freedom. They were trying to reach Jeremiah one last time. On the 3rd night, as Jeremiah sat in his jail cell awaiting trial, he heard a familiar voice calling softly from the window. Marcus and Timothy had somehow made their way into town, past the patrols, past the guards, to say goodbye to the man they had loved in whatever way enslaved people could love their master. "Mr. Jeremiah," Marcus whispered through the bars, "we want you to know Caesar was right. None of this was force. Whatever happens to you, whatever they do to us, remember that we chose this. We chose you." Timothy pressed something through the bars, a small wooden carving he had made years earlier, depicting the 3 of them working together in the plantation workshop. "We were happy," he said simply. "For a little while we were happy." Jeremiah reached through the bars, touching their hands one final time. "I am so sorry," he whispered. "I am sorry for everything this has cost you." But their reunion was brief. The sound of approaching horses meant the patrol had found them. Marcus and Timothy exchanged one last look with Jeremiah, then disappeared back into the darkness. They were captured an hour later, hiding in the plantation's chapel, of all places. The trial was swift and merciless. Judge Harrison Blackwood, known throughout the state for his strict interpretation of biblical law, presided over proceedings that everyone knew were merely a formality. With Caesar dead by his own hand, Marcus and Timothy were condemned to hang for their participation in what the court termed abominable crimes against nature and proper order. A Judge Blackwood reserved special punishment for Jeremiah. Rather than execution, which would have been merciful, he sentenced him to witness the hangings of Marcus and Timothy, followed by 100 lashes administered publicly over 5 days, then permanent exile from South Carolina. "You will watch these men die knowing your depravity brought them to the gallows," the judge declared. "You will carry the scars of your shame on your body for the rest of your life." And you will live knowing that 3 young men are dead because you could not control your unnatural desires. The executions took place on a blazing September morning in Beaufort's town square. Nearly 800 people gathered to witness what many called divine justice. Martha stood in the front row, dressed in black silk, watching as the 2 men who had shared her husband's bed prepared to die. Marcus faced death with quiet dignity, saying nothing from the gallows platform. But Timothy, barely 20 years old, looked out at the crowd and spoke words that would be remembered long after the scaffold was dismantled. "You call this justice," he said, his young voice carrying across the silent square. "But the only crime here is that we were born slaves and he was born free. If we had been born equal, this would be called love." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, demanding he be silenced. But Timothy continued, "You will hang us to protect your precious order, but your order is built on lies. Mr. Jeremiah treated us better than you treat your own wives. He gave us dignity you never gave your own children, and now you kill us to feel righteous about your own sins." The executioner placed the noose around Timothy's neck, ending his speech forever. Both men died quickly, their necks snapping cleanly as the crowd watched in satisfied silence. Jeremiah witnessed it all, chained to a post 20 feet from the gallows, forced to watch as the 2 men he had loved in his broken, impossible way swung lifeless in the morning sun. Something died in him that day that no amount of physical punishment could touch. The whippings that followed were brutal beyond description. 20 lashes each day for 5 days, administered by the county's strongest man while hundreds watched. By the 3rd day, Jeremiah's back was raw meat. By the 5th day, he was unconscious more than awake, but he survived, scarred permanently, branded forever as a sodomite and corrupter of slaves. On the day of his exile, as Jeremiah stumbled from Beaufort for the last time, Martha approached him one final time. She had come to ensure her revenge was complete, to see her husband broken and defeated. "Was it worth it?" she asked coldly. "Was your unnatural love worth 3 lives and your eternal damnation?" Jeremiah looked at her with eyes that held no anger, no hatred, just infinite sadness. "You will never understand," he said quietly. "For 12 years I tried to be the husband you wanted, the man society demanded. But with them, for just a few stolen hours, I was who I truly was. Yes, Martha, it was worth it. Not their deaths, never their deaths, but the love we shared, broken and impossible as it was. That was the only real thing in my entire life." Martha had expected groveling, begging, acknowledgement of sin and wrongdoing. Instead, she received something that terrified her more than any confession ever could. She received the truth. Jeremiah had loved those men more than he had ever loved her, and even facing exile and bearing permanent scars, he regretted nothing except their deaths. Jeremiah disappeared into the vastness of America, another ghost fleeing from the rigid moral certainties of the antebellum South. Some say he died within a year, unable to survive without the privilege and protection he had always known. Others whisper he made it to California, where he lived quietly under an assumed name until the scars on his back finally told their story to someone who cared enough to listen. Martha returned to Charleston, resuming her family name and living as a respectable widow. But those who knew her said she was never the same. She had destroyed her husband completely, orchestrated the deaths of 3 young men, and exposed secrets that destroyed dozens of families connected to Magnolia Grove Plantation. In seeking justice for her betrayal, she had become something far worse than anything Jeremiah had ever been. The scandal echoed through South Carolina society for decades. Whispered warnings to young men about the consequences of unnatural vice, cautionary tales about the dangers of being too familiar with slaves, reminders that even the most respected citizens could hide terrible secrets. But the real lesson, the one no one wanted to acknowledge, was far more disturbing. In a society built on the absolute power of white men over black bodies, where enslaved people had no legal right to refuse their masters' demands, the law had executed 2 men for being victims of that very system. Caesar, Marcus, and Timothy had no choice but to comply with Jeremiah's desires, yet they died for participating in acts they could not legally refuse. The contradiction was stark, brutal, and revealing of how quickly society would sacrifice its most vulnerable members to maintain comfortable illusions about moral order. Years later, when historians finally examined the sealed records of the Caldwell case, they found something that had been hidden from public view. Among Jeremiah's personal papers, confiscated during his arrest, were dozens of letters written by Caesar, Marcus, and Timothy. Letters that revealed not coercion or abuse, but genuine affection, gratitude for small kindnesses, and something that looked remarkably like love within the impossible constraints of their situation. These letters complicated the narrative society preferred, the story of innocent slaves corrupted by depraved master. Instead, they revealed three intelligent, complex human beings who had found ways to create meaning, connection, and even happiness within the brutal system that owned their bodies. They had chosen, within the limited options available to enslaved people, to find whatever dignity and affection they could. But those letters remained sealed, their contents too dangerous to reveal to a society that needed its victims to be perfect and its villains to be monsters. The truth was messier, more human, and ultimately more tragic than any simple moral tale could contain. Today, if you visit what was once Magnolia Grove Plantation, you will find a historical marker that mentions the scandal briefly, calling it a reminder of how slavery corrupted both enslaved and enslaver. But the marker says nothing about love, nothing about the impossible choices people made within an impossible system, nothing about the three young men who died not as victims of seduction, but as casualties of a society that could not admit its own contradictions. The ghosts of Caesar, Marcus, Timothy, and even Jeremiah Caldwell still walk those grounds. Reminders that history's most disturbing stories are often the ones that refuse to fit neatly into categories of good and evil, victim and perpetrator, justice and injustice. Sometimes the most profound tragedies occur when love blooms in soil too poisoned to let it survive.